My name is Jasmine Conrad, and I have a PhD in art and architectural history from Columbia University. And while I was there, I taught the Great Books course on literature. And one of the things we taught was the Odyssey. And I actually created a set of tours for that class that we gave to all the students in the course at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was working at the Met at the same time. And so I thought I'd put together a short tour of the Odyssey at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I thought we would start with this piece, which is a really interesting piece, but also it's sort of at the entrance to the Greek and Roman galleries. It's also a good entry point to talking about these Greek myths because it was made around the period that the Homeric epics came together in the version that we kind of know of them now. Around the period they were sort of composed in this version, let's put it that way. And the Iliad and the Odyssey are, of course, set 400 years before, which is to say they're set at the fall of Troy, which is about 1200 BCE. And then they get composed in this form around 800 BCE. So that's a long period. It's 400 years in between. And those 400 years, if you want to kind of make a contemporary comparison, this is like the difference between us and Shakespeare, right? So this is long. So this was made in the 700s, so it's even a little bit more recent than the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And what is this thing? It's a funerary crater. And these objects were originally made to mix water and wine for symposiums or symposia. And the symposium was this kind of drunken feast that you'd have at home, and you'd mix water and wine in these big craters. And they became used later as funerary markers. And we know that they are funerary markers for a couple of reasons. One is that it actually has a depiction of a dead person at the top, which we'll get to. But also, what you can't see, there's a hole in the bottom of this. And the hole is for the pouring of libations, which is a really important ritual that shows up again and again in these Homeric texts. In fact, one of Aeschylus's great plays, which is again set in this era, is called the Libation Bearer. So these are really important rituals. And by the way, they're rituals that the gods do too. And the scene itself, like I said, is a scene of a dead person. This is a funeral, basically. And that horizontal body at the top is the deceased, is the body. And you see this kind of funny checkered shape thing above the body. That's supposed to be the funeral shroud. And there's a direct relationship with the Odyssey here, because what Penelope is weaving every day and unraveling is one of these things, a funeral shroud. And then underneath you have this double row of chariots. That's kind of interesting because at this point, chariots aren't really an important they don't have an important military use at this point. They're more used for racing and for ceremonies. And so it's an interesting question why you have images of sort of an outdated mode of fighting. And I think really what you're doing is you're trying to express something that puts you in this grand tradition of the Homeric epics, sort of puts you back in time in this period when chariots are used a lot and places you amongst these sort of very famous heroes. The thing I really like about this piece when we're talking about the Odyssey and where it's a good place to start is this point about how different and how unexpected I think it is in how it looks, right? And so when we think about Greek art and architecture and literature, when we think about literature, we certainly think about the Homerian epics, and we think about plays, and when we think about Greek art, we think about usually figural art with really beautiful naturalistic representations of humans. We really don't think about this. And in fact, you should keep in mind when you're reading the Odyssey and the Iliad that this is the visual culture in which these epics sort of come together and are composed in the form that we come to know them today. It's not the kind of big marble statues. So let's go look at some Mycenaean art, and we'll talk about what's in between the fall of Troy and when these epics get written down. Okay, so I have a little bit of a confession, which is that If we want to do an Odyssey tour of the Met Museum, we have a problem. And the problem is that the Trojan War is set, as I mentioned, in about 1200 BCE. But we don't really have a lot of stuff from that period. And the stuff that we do have from that period is mostly really from other locations. And this problem is that between about 1200 and about 800, when the Odyssey and the Iliad get composed, there is what's called the Greek Dark Ages. And it's preceded around 1200 by what's called the Late Bronze Age collapse. And the Late Bronze Age collapse happens sort of throughout the Mediterranean, and it's still quite mysterious. We don't really know what happened. But there was a lot of wars. The archaeological evidence changes a lot. You go from having centralized systems of government to much more rural settlement patterns. And again, it's sort of throughout the Mediterranean. We have Hittite kingdoms having problems. We have the Greek kingdoms having problems. The Egyptians are incursions into their civilization. So it's a period that we don't have a lot of great material history in this collection. And this stuff is the stuff that is contemporary to the period in which the Odyssey is set. And this is probably the best one to look at because at least it has figures. You know, these aren't great. And I think this, again, is very shocking because when you think about the Odyssey and the Iliad and you think about the period in which it's set, I don't think we think about it being as sort of early and ancient of a civilization than it actually was. I mean, this is relatively rudimentary, right, for figural decoration. And so the world of the Trojan War, it's Bronze Age. You know, you're sort of not too far out of the Neolithic. It is hard for us to recognize these civilizations. They're really so far in the ancient past. Now, this stuff, which isn't terribly interesting, by the way, it's called Mycenaean because it's after the kingdom of Mycenae, which is Agamemnon's kingdom, and he shows up in all these myths, a very important warrior king. We do have some things from historical Troy in this collection, which is really unusual. So I want to show you those next. Okay, so I wanted to show you the few things that we have that are actually from historical Troy. And that's this set of objects above me. And the recovery of historical Troy is actually a pretty fascinating story. So, you know, for a long time, people weren't really sure if there was a true historical Troy. There was this concept that, well, you know, these are myths, maybe this wasn't a real place. And even if it was a real place, nobody knew where it was. And it was really kind of found by this really interesting and kind of bananas German businessman who had made an absolute fortune at a very, very young age. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann. And he actually retired at the age of 36 in order to devote the rest of his life to finding historical Troy. And he was, by the way, aided in this in the fact that he was first of all very smart, and second of all, he spoke a lot of languages, including Greek, fluently. He started digging in April of 1870. And what's incredible about this to me is that is exactly the same month that the Metropolitan Museum of Art was incorporated. It was incorporated April 13th, 1870. So literally the same month as this museum, not in this form, but its original form, is founded, Schliemann is off trying to find stuff at historical Troy. And he does. And he thinks that these things are actually from the period of the Trojan War. So again, about 1200 BC. Turns out he's wrong. They're not. They're actually about 1,000 years earlier than that. So they're from something, I think, like 2200. Yeah, 23 to 2000 BCE. So they're a lot earlier. He used methods that would not be appropriate today, but this was at the beginning of archaeology when there weren't sort of normal controls and recordings that we would make now of finds. And it was a very, very different period. And in fact, he got in trouble because he smuggled this stuff out of historical Troy, which is in modern day Turkey. And of course, then it was the Ottoman Empire, and he didn't have any permits from the Ottoman Empire. And so he snuck it out into Greece and he later had to pay a fine. I can't really tell you a lot about them, but they are from the place that fell in the Trojan War, which, by the way, we think that that version of Troy is what's now called Troy 6. And the other thing I want to mention about these is just this sort of odd vase bottle thing on the top. And you might even be able to see in this video that it's a very strange color. It's an odd color because it's made of electrum. And electrum is a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. So you see, it just has a kind of unusual tone, and that's why. It's also quite an odd shape, and I think you can see there's little sort of holes on either side and then on the lid. My sense is this probably had either a handle, maybe a rigid handle, or maybe even like a rope or a chain or something. You know, I'm not sure what people think this was used for, because it's obviously a very, very expensive object. And these objects, by the way, were found together. So they belong together in some sense. Okay, so let's move on and actually look at stuff that has images of people in the stories that we want to talk about, the Odyssey. Okay, so to actually talk about Odysseus or look at Odysseus, we have to go forward. So these pieces were made in about 450, and they're some of the only images of Odysseus that are actually in this collection. There aren't very many at all, which is kind of an interesting point. And these are these little plaques, and there are a couple of scenes of Odysseus sort of returning home. So there's Penelope, there's Telemachus. However, they're really quite ugly and very low quality, and I don't want to talk about them, but I want you to know they're here. So we'll talk about another much better depiction of Odysseus upstairs. I wanted to show you this quite small vessel, and it is just this figure of a man who's got a drawn bow, right? It's quite beautifully drawn, actually. And the reason that we think that this is Odysseus is because a really important plot point in the Odyssey is when Odysseus comes back home to Ithaca and he takes up his bow, and that's his weapon, right? His weapon is his mind and his bow. And there's this bow that nobody else can string. Nobody is strong enough to string this bow. And string just means literally attach the string from one end to the other, which is hard to do. The stronger the bow is, the harder it is to do. And the idea is he's the only person who can make this bow work. And then he goes on and uses this bow and kills all sort of the bad guys at home in Ithaca, as well as some other people. And you also can see maybe that his hair is sort of messy. And this idea is that, you know, when Odysseus comes back to Ithaca, he comes disguised as a beggar. And the idea is, you know, his messy hair is kind of a representation of that. This is before he reveals himself to be Odysseus. And one of the ways he reveals himself and proves himself to be Odysseus is that he strings this bow. There are a couple of things I wanted to mention with this piece. One is purely artistic because, you know, it's really small and it's not it's not like a super, super high-end piece of art. But it's really well done, I think, and it really accomplishes what it sets out to accomplish. And it has this real energy in the figure. I mean, first of all, there's the energy of the drawn bow, which I think we all kind of implicitly understand that there's motion involved there. And if you look closely, you can see he's got very good bow posture. So he's got his bow out like this, actually in his left hand, and then his right arm, I'm going to do it the other way so you can see it. Bow, and then he's drawing straight back like this, his bow string, right? And that's how you get all the force out of your nice big muscles in your shoulders. And he's standing forward like this, so he's braced, nicely braced. But you get this sense of kind of forward motion, partly because of this leg that's bending. And if you can see the detail here, you can see also that his tunic at the bottom is sort of rippling, and it kind of goes out to the side that it looks like he's moving in. And so this piece, with very little, with great economy, manages to accomplish and communicate quite a lot. And I think that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting to me about this is the point that we have one figure on this little vase. That's it. It's just this guy with the bow. And yet, we can figure out who it is We can figure out where it is in the story. And that speaks to something in sort of the philosophy of these mythological traditions, which is that they are these scenes, right? And we know that the way that these things were often consumed was that you were having a fancy dinner party, you hire somebody to come over, basically, and sing parts of the epics for you. And you would kind of request, you'd sort of say, you know, I want this bit or that bit. You're not going to sit and listen to the entire Odyssey one night, probably. There are these scenes, right? And these scenes get repeated. By the way, we know that the scene that was most repeated, that was most told, that was most requested is everybody's favorite scene in the Odyssey, which is when Odysseus comes back and his dog recognizes him, his faithful dog that's been waiting for him all these years. That seems to be the thing people like the most. And we know that because those are the fragments that survive at the highest rate. We have more versions of that than any other scene. So these stories that have these important sort of set pieces, I think are sort of reflected in this piece of art, which has just this one figure. But when you know the story and the placement of it, you kind of can expand the world of this one little figure and the story of this one little figure to something that's a lot greater. And that is a really important aspect of all of this art. Anything that's figured like this usually is engaged with stories. They're showing you scenes, figures, images from mythological or semi-mythological, semi-historical stories like this one. So I just wanted to show you a detail of this so you can actually see the painting because we really couldn't get a nice view of it for you through the glass. So I wanted to say one more thing about this piece because the more I think about it, actually the more I like it and the more interesting it is. And I want to talk about the composition because I think this idea, we have just this, one lone figure, and the figure is completely surrounded by black paint. It's totally black, and there's nobody else in the scene. And that's actually very important for the character of Odysseus because, in fact, when he returns home, he is completely alone. And he's completely alone because all of his men are killed, every single one of them. And that's largely his own fault. I mean, most of them don't even die in battle, they die on the way back. And this brings up, how complicated of a character Odysseus is. Because on the one hand, he's quite a good leader. I mean, he's a very good fighter. He's great with his bow and arrow. He's very, very smart. He can, figure his way through things. He can think through things. He can think a step ahead. He can strategize. But on the other hand, he loses every single one of his men, 12 ships full of men with about maybe 50 people in each one. Even Odysseus's abilities are flawed, right? Like, he is a very flawed character. So even the things he's good at somehow have this double-edged sword. So for example, we know that he is really good at communications, let's say. He's really good at talking. And yet, he's unable to convince his own men not to eat the sacred cattle of Helios. And that winds up killing all of them that are left over at that point, basically. So I think there's something very accurate about this little amphora because it shows something that really gets to the heart of the problem of the Odyssey, which is this hero, this leader, who's loses everyone that he is supposed to be leading. This is from something like 440 BC. So this is the kind of period in which Greek art really starts looking like what we kind of in the popular imagination associate with Greek art. And this figure is identified as Odysseus chasing Circe. So we have Odysseus here center right, and then on the left we have a figure that's half human and half boar. And then all the way on the right, we have a woman who's sort of fleeing with both of her hands up, and falling from her, apparently, are these two objects. One is a cup, and one is sort of looks like a stick, but it's actually a magic wand. So Circe is a sorceress,
And in fact, we can tell exactly what scene this is in the Odyssey. And when I say scene, I mean, we can really tell literally the exact line this is taken from in the Odyssey.
So I had to refilm this because we kept getting interrupted at the museum. It was a very, very busy day there, and people kept sort of wanting to know what we were doing. But I wanted to tell you the story of Circe because it's quite an important one. Circe is a sorceress, and some of Odysseus's men go and they come upon her in her house, and she invites them in. And one of them suspects that this is a trick, and so he stays outside. And he's right, it is a trick. She brings them inside, she gives them food, but actually the food has been drugged. And then she taps them with her wand and turns them into pigs. And the guy who has not been turned into a pig goes back to Odysseus, says, "We have a problem." And Odysseus is then helped by Hermes, who's the messenger god. And Hermes gives Odysseus another drug that will counteract Circe's drug. And Circe's drug is specifically described as something that will make the men forget their homes. And I think this is actually a very, very important and interesting point. And so Odysseus goes off. He's helped by this sort of antidote. Circe indeed gives him this poison, taps him with her wand, but nothing happens. And then Odysseus rushes at her with his sword drawn, which Hermes has told him to do. And immediately Circe sort of submits to him. And then, as Hermes has also warned Odysseus is going to happen, she invites Odysseus to her bed and she says, "Do this so that we can trust each other." And Hermes has also advised Odysseus that he better make her swear that she won't keep him really against his will. And they go to bed together. She turns his men back into men. And in fact, they're taller and stronger and more handsome than before. So it kind of works out. Um, and then they stay for a year, an entire year they stay with Circe. And then one of the men sort of takes Odysseus aside and says, "Hey, remember how we were like, going to go home?" And then Odysseus asks Circe for her help to get back. And she actually does give him a lot of help in getting back. And I'm going to flip back to what we filmed at the Met to explain why this is, I think, a really interesting point. There's a lot of ways to talk about the story of the Odyssey, but one of them is as a set of metaphors about re-entering sort of normalized civilian life after being in a violent conflict. And that all of these problems that Odysseus encounters on the way home are really metaphors for psychological states that a warrior finds himself in when he is trying to move out of that state of war. That's really kind of the interesting thing about this. I also quite like the figures on the side. Circe is known for turning men into animal beasts, and those are quite nice little depictions. Actually, just in this gallery, by the way, we have more depictions of Helen than we do of Odysseus, and there are more depictions of Helen in this collection. And I'm going to show you one right over here. It's really small. It's this tiny little egg. And this is probably depicting the abduction of Helen by Paris, which of course is the thing that really kicks off the Trojan War. And this is a little vase that would have had a lid. And these little egg-shaped things were used, and by the way, eggs themselves, were used as funerary offerings. And here's just a still of this so you can actually see the detail. As you can tell, I mean, it's really incredibly carefully and beautifully painted, this piece. So I wanted to show you this cup because this is quite cool. Not so much the object per se, it's not that interesting. However, it is possibly a scene related to the Odyssey. So the two figures on the top, it may be Menelaus, Helen's original husband, reclaiming her, taking her back. Uncertain. But what's really interesting is there's writing on the bottom of the foot of this piece, in Greek, obviously. And what it says is really fascinating. What it says is, "I am Melusa's prize. She won me in the karting contest." And carding is one of the steps in preparing wool to make textiles. You take wool and you comb it so that all the fibers are lying in the same direction. And then you put it on a distaff and then you spin it from there. And then once it's spun, then of course you weave it into becoming a textile. I think this is fascinating because it shows us that there were female competitions, and that female competitions, at least in part, had to do with textile production. And textiles are the piece of visual evidence that we just have almost completely lost historically. And yet we know they were wildly important. So one of the centerpieces of, for example, the Panathenaic Festival, which is the high festival of Athens during the period when Athens is the most powerful city-state, was this parade, and women of Athens would present to the statue of Athena a cloak that was woven for the statue, and it was woven every year, and it was, you know, something you would get picked to do, and it was an honor to be involved with. So textile production is just incredibly important. And we just don't know much about it, really, for two reasons. One is that textiles don't survive. And the other reason is that textiles were very much women's work. And in fact, if you want to read a great book, really one of the most important books on material history, in my opinion, ever written. It's a wonderful book called Women's Work, and it's all about textile production and the history of textile production and how unbelievably important it is. And, you know, we have a lot of prizes for men, and specifically male athletes. Male athletes would be given jugs and, you know, cups like this. But we don't have a lot of examples like this of prizes for women and women's competitions and women's art forms. And this is really relevant to the Odyssey, not because this is maybe a picture of Helen and Menelaus. It's interesting because, in fact, textile production is a really important part of these epic stories. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit.
So, to talk about how important textiles are, I wanted to show you this piece, which is in the Met, but I couldn't get a good image of it because of the reflections on the case. So I'm doing this by voiceover. But this shows us women weaving at an upright loom, which is the type of loom that women would have been using during the Bronze Age. And this, you might notice that this looks a little bit different than a lot of the stuff we've been looking at. It's actually a little bit earlier. It's from the 500s BCE. And the way in which textiles are most obviously central to the story of the Odyssey is that this is one of Penelope's sort of central ruses to fend off these men who, in the absence of her husband, are trying to marry her, but really what they're trying to do is take over her estate. And for 3 years, Penelope puts them off by saying that, you know, before she gets married, she has to finish this big project, and the project is weaving a funeral shroud for her father in law, for Odysseus's father, Laertes. And then at night, she comes back and she unweaves what she's been weaving during the day. And this scene of Penelope weaving and unweaving, or these many scenes of her weaving and unweaving, are one of the sort of visual ideas and narrative ideas that artists are most interested in over time. This is actually one of the ideas that a lot of people reinterpret and talk about for many thousands of years. And I think it's because there's something very clearly meaningful about the idea of doing and undoing work, but also this kind of very clear relationship with time, with weaving, right? Where, you know, an hour is maybe an inch of something that you have woven. And now we're going to go back into the galleries and look at a scene that's actually from the Iliad.
I wanted to show you this amphora because it gets to issues that are really central to the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are questions of sacrilegiousness, questions of breaking of laws, especially sort of moral and divine laws. So this is also from around 450 BCE, like a lot of the vases we've looked at, you know, are from roughly the same period. And this is an image, it's quite a disturbing image. So the figure that we have looking towards you on our left is a cult statue of Athena. right? So this is a statue of the goddess. And you can see that sort of at her knees, there's a woman who's got her hands clasped around the statue. And then on our right, there is this woman who's mostly nude, sort of slightly draped, who's grabbing the cult statue around her neck. And then there's this man on the right who's grabbing the woman. And this is Cassandra and Ajax. Ajax is one of the Greek heroes. This is a scene of the sack of Troy. And Cassandra is the most beautiful of the king of Troy, who's King Priam. She's his most beautiful daughter. And she takes sanctuary at the temple of Athena. And this is a moral and legal sanctuary. And Ajax doesn't care. Ajax takes her and rapes her anyway. And this, again, it gets to why the Trojan War happens in the first place, and also why Odysseus is stuck, why gods are mad at him. Because they do stuff like this, and they do a lot of stuff like this. It's not just this. Achilles desecrates the body of one of the great heroes of Troy. Odysseus's men eat Helios's cows. So Helios is the sun god, and he has the sacred herd of cows, and Odysseus's men eat them. But again, it sort of goes on and on. And my understanding is that the movie doesn't really engage with this issue of the gods and humans, but in the Odyssey and the Iliad and in this period, these relationships are central to the philosophy of how the world works. And I think it's really important to note that these gods are not better than you or more moral or more just, really. They're just more powerful because the gods do this stuff too, right? And you do something like this, and what you're going to do is make Athena angry because this is her sanctuary. So you're disrespecting Athena when you do this. It's not that Athena is necessarily so angry that you did something so violent and evil and horrible, but rather it's disrespectful to her. Another thing that's pretty amazing about this piece, what it represents, what's called the Rape of Cassandra, is really how long these stories are current. So again, we're looking at something from about 450, scenes that are thought to be about 800 years before that. And in fact, the area of ancient Greece where Ajax, this warrior, was from, for 1,000 years, sent 2 virgins every year from their area to the temple of Athena in order to expiate Ajax's crime of raping Cassandra. And so when we talk about these myths, right, we can see them, of course, in these images and these sculptures and paintings that survive. But it's really important to remember that these aren't just stories. These are foundation myths that continue for many, many hundreds of years, in this case, 1,000 years, to affect real people's lives, politics, economics, the movement of people. I mean, these things are set in motion by the Trojan War and still happening 1,000 years later. And that's quite, I think, an incredible thing. And one last thing I'll say about this is it brings up the extraordinary violence of the Trojan War. And the Trojan War was understood to be unusually violent. So I want to end with something that really has nothing obvious to do with the Odyssey at all, but everything to do with the Odyssey. This is one of my very favorite pieces in the entire Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. It's another funerary marker. This one is in Parian marble, so marble from the island of Paros. And of course, we often, associate Greek art of the kind of Greek golden age of being these beautiful marble sculptures. And this is a funerary marker for a little girl. And these little birds are her pet doves. And she's kissing them goodbye. And of course, the implication is that she somehow knows about her own death, right? And I think this is, well, first of all, it's incredibly beautiful, this piece. But second of all, it's very moving. And I love this piece because it brings up a much bigger point about how we remember history. And, it's very easy to stand in front of this monument and think about who this little girl was who died so young. There's this poignancy to this piece. But the reason that we can think about her as an individual, the reason that we knew she existed, the reason that in New York City, in this metropolis of millions of people, we can stand and think about this little girl who died, over 2,000 years ago, is because her parents hired a really good artist to make this beautiful piece. And the fact that we remember things comes down to artistic production and reproduction. And in the Odyssey and the Iliad, these Homeric myths, we have a couple of really important artists, I would argue. One of them is Helen herself. So when we first encounter Helen, she's weaving, and she's weaving this giant cloak with scenes of the Trojan War in it. The other, I think, artist we have is Odysseus. A great proportion of the Odyssey is actually Odysseus recounting stories. It's not an omniscient narrator saying this thing happened to Odysseus. It's actually Odysseus himself saying, these are the things that happened to me. And he's telling these stories to a king who's kind of helping him in the process of getting home. And what we know about Odysseus is he's tricky, right? He's the guy who comes up with the idea of the Trojan horse. He can use his mind to figure his way out of situations. And he's a very good talker. And this is one of the things that this king says to him. He says, the way you've spoken, basically, about your experiences teaches us things. So I would argue that Odysseus is sort of depicted as an artist, really as sort of as a writer. But of course, we have one really important author who is Homer himself, if he's actually a historical figure. And let's finish by looking at a nice image of somebody like Homer. Well, I sort of lied at the last stop because I think I said I wanted to end there, but I really want to actually end here with this beautiful, beautiful vase from around 490 BC. So this is actually a little bit older than some of the other things we've been looking at. Not a lot, but a little bit. And we were talking about the artist and the place of the artist. And I think the most important people that we're talking about when we talk about these great epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey are the reason that we know these stories, which are the authors and all these people who interpreted it. So, we know in our contemporary world the Odyssey as a poem. We usually read it as a book, but that's not the historical way in which these stories were transmitted. They were transmitted orally. And we know that for sure, these stories were told for a long time before they were collected together and compiled and, made into a kind of cohesive, coherent narrative. Because there are different strands of these myths and different strands of these stories, slightly different versions, for example, sometimes quite different versions. And maybe somebody like this, who's depicted here, is one of the people who would have been responsible for composing and transmitting these wonderful pieces of literature. This is a picture of a youth playing a kind of a Greek lyre, let's say, a harp thing, and singing. And this is what we sort of expect the normal mode of transmissions of the Odyssey to have been. That it was oral traditions, it was performed by these people called rhapsodes. This is where we get our word rhapsody or rhapsodic, right? And these people, by the way, are intimately related to textiles. The word rhapsode actually means like stringer together of tales. And there's this long concept in Greek mythology and Greek philosophy and Greek thought in the relationship between time and thread. And in fact, we're all controlled by three sisters who are the three fates. And the first fate spins our life when we're born. She takes wool from the distaff and she spins a thread. And the next fate measures the thread, and that's the length of our life. And then the last fate snips the thread, and that's the end of our life. That's our death. And, the only way that we live on beyond our death is if somebody tells our stories, right? If somebody talks about it, if somebody keeps talking about it, and if these tales keep being transmitted, repurposed, reused, retold. And so I think when you're talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey and these wonderful pieces of literature, the most important person you could talk about, though often the most mysterious, are the people that wrote these wonderful poems. And that's where I'll end. Let me know if you'd like to see more of these. There's a lot of other things I could talk about at the Met. I thought one that would be particularly fun to do, because I have a lot of interest in it, is a tour of the Met of historical arms and armor that are related to ancient Greece and specifically to the Odyssey. We could also talk about clothes, and there's other objects that we could relate to these stories if we wanted to. So let me know.